There are few games that elicit such an incredibly visceral response to a single note of their soundtrack. Fewer draw that same response from a mainstream audience, but over the last 20 years, Halo has risen above our gaming sphere, and despite some failed attempts to literally do so with movies and TV shows, Halo has cultivated a mass following that has continually been drawn to our green-clad hero.
They are no longer your people.
Not that one. Or that one. Halo is 20 years old now, and when 3 years is a long time in video games, Halo is almost a dinosaur in comparison. For a single game franchise to stand the test of time and find relevance in one way or another for 2 decades is remarkable, especially in such a competitive genre. Since its debut in 2001 on the original Xbox after being stolen away from Apple, we have seen the devs behind Combat Evolved release a critically acclaimed trilogy and 2 spin-offs before moving on and away from Xbox and give us 2 very popular Destiny games. We've had a whole new studio be built specifically to fill those large shoes Bungie left behind. We've had remakes and we've had strategy games. But in that time, Master Chief has lost some of his luster, I think it's fair to say. He's seen off many contenders to the throne, but in more recent years, the likes of Call of Duty, Doom and Titanfall have surpassed him. And at one time, many first-person shooters were dubbed Halo killers, but that has long since passed, and while people still like the multiplayer when it worked, the stories have become stale and lacked imagination compared to those that I've just named. Titanfall 2 had one of the best stories in a first-person shooter ever. Call of Duty's played around with different time periods, and Doom is... well, Doom is Doom. Eventually, Halo fell down the pecking order, and instead of leading the way, became a bit more of a follower, somewhat losing its identity along the way. But I'm here to relive the glory days. 20 years on, is the OG Halo still as masterful as we remember, or is that one Halo ring that is best left alone? Welcome back to Eat Sleep Game. My name is Luke, and to celebrate 20 years of Halo, I have been playing Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. While the team have done a great job of upgrading and modernising the classic visuals, I would be remiss if I didn't say that it does look a little rougher around the edges than I was expecting, but that doesn't negate the vast improvement to the visuals on the whole. Stepping out of that escape pod and gazing up at the Halo ring, reach to the stars and back around under your feet is a little breathtaking, and it gives you a real idea of the size and scale of these iconic Halo rings. However, I do genuinely prefer some of the original visuals in comparison, especially with being able to flick between both in the Master Chief collection. While there is no argument that technically the updated visuals are by far and away better, some areas lose some of the charm of the original game by overdoing some environments and making them almost too vibrant, with some more stereotypical alien looking textures opposed to the original's much simpler designs. The original had a lot more darkness as well, which really added to the atmosphere of these alien ships and added to the depth and scale to some of the interiors. But with so much more lighting and being able to see so much more, there is that bit less unknown, which takes away some of the truly alien feel and aura to those areas for me. Which is, again, not to say the newer look is terrible by any way, shape or form. They have still done a fantastic job. I just feel the simplicity of the originals work that bit better for me. The game, of course, does have a nice amount of variety in its environments, from the woodlands to the snow-covered areas and some swampy environments, but some of these environments are used less and less as the game goes on and moves more indoors, which is a shame because I would have loved to have seen more of the Halo ring and other areas on it. On that point, I would have liked to see the Halo rings just have some different environments. While, as mentioned, the game does have some variety, they are pretty standard environments. The Halo rings are such an interesting and unique setting. To have them just look pretty much like Earth feels a little bit of a waste to me. That is, however, just a really minor complaint. What we do have looks wonderful, and this is really where the updated visuals come into their own, is in the big open landscapes. And I can't help but to wonder, especially with Halo Infinite coming very soon, how beautiful all these incredible environments would look if they were remade once again in today's technology. The world was beautiful in 2001 and again in 2014 when this game was relaunched. The design and overall way the world, or ring in this case, is built would be jaw-dropping in 2021 visuals. I would have also liked it if the environments were a little bit more fleshed out rather than mostly being used as small arenas, especially towards the climax of the campaign before heading back inside, because the times when the game does use the environments more, I find that they were well designed, and along with the good AI of the game, they offer some good challenge that didn't get overly frustrating. Well, initially. We'll get onto that a bit later. Enemy design is still great, and 343 have done a wonderful job of not losing any of the character or charm of the enemies when flipping between the older and updated visuals. In fact, paired with the updated animations, I actually think it's fair to argue that they have added to the character of each of the enemy types, with a number of enemies that look more imposing and, for lack of a better term, bulkier. Unlike the interior alien environments, the more you can see of these enemies, the more it benefits them as they look more the part of the imposing force. Well, except for the grunts, who are meant to look meek, and the flood, which I still think has a pretty terrible design. And I mean, the actual flood creatures, not the infected or possessed enemies, like, they just look like they're coming to clean your car, and their animations do nothing to help that. It's not like I need to tell you that the iconic soundtrack is excellent. Woven into situations expertly, it does such a marvellous job of amping the player up in battle and then calm them once the dust has settled. Like many, I could easily just sit on the menu screen and happily listen to that main theme all day, but it just gets so much better when it hits in the middle of a battle, making each encounter feel more epic. Sound effects are also of a pretty good quality if they seem to be mostly reused and unchanged, which is probably for the best. Similarly to the soundtrack, so many of these sound effects are iconic and instantly recognizable, from the sound of needler ammo flying, piercing, and then exploding in your enemies, or that all too familiar sound of your shield being blasted away. The same can also be said for the enemies and vehicles, just perhaps to a lesser extent. The alien chattering of the generals as they command their forces, or the simple sound of a warthog tearing over terrain and enemies alike, are all of a good quality. Voiceover, on the other hand, isn't great. Most of it is very stilted and sounds like each actor recorded every single line individually, both from their other lines and from the other actors. The dialogue is very chopped and stuck together at points. And as iconic as Chief's voice is, it is just so boring, and he sounds equally bored when delivering those lines. That being said, however, a good job has been done with the updated audio effects, as it feels more focused on the player with much less echo and reverberation, instead of feeling like you and the NPC are the only ones talking very loudly in a big old cathedral.
Chief, please look around the room. I need to get a calibration reading for your battlesuit's diagnostics. Good.
Aboard an under attack Pillar of Autumn, after coming across and intending to investigate the mysterious Halo rings, the UNSC are boarded by the Covenant, an alien religious alliance whose devil may or may not be the human race, leading to the ship's captain awakening their legendary hero from cryosleep. Not that one, and no, not that one again. The Covenant forces are overwhelming, and the only option is to hop into an escape pod and head to the mysterious Halo ring below. As the Master Chief fights his way through the enemies and moves closer to the center of the Halo ring, he finds out more and more about its origins and its true purpose. In hindsight, the game story is a pretty decent one, with an interesting and mysterious setting and a decent turn later on. However, during the playthrough, the story feels very secondary to the gameplay, as you would go a fair stretch simply mowing through wave after wave of enemies with little more than a "hey, we need to go to this location, don't worry about why." And in reality, there isn't too much story to talk about here, because the gameplay is the main focus of the game. The story is more or less there to give the game a campaign campaign, which was much more of the norm at the time of release, with online multiplayer not being as prevalent as it is 20 years on. I'm not saying the story is bad, it just lacks much in the way of depth and hits a lot of beats that we've seen numerous times before, which works when the combat and gameplay is the main draw of the game. You don't necessarily want to spend time in cutscenes when you could be shooting aliens in the face. The stories do come into their own much later in the franchise with supplementary games like ODST and Reach, but here, there's not too much to talk about. The lack of a compelling story did become an issue for me later on in the game, however, when I found myself backtracking through areas I had already visited, just with many more enemies and an equal amount of hair-tearing deaths. I found myself really struggling with pushing through the back end of the game with all this extra frustration, which I will get onto in the gameplay section, while not really having all that much motivation story-wise as well. I found that a few times when I kept being killed by the increased wave of enemies, I was left wondering what I was doing and why I was pushing on beyond bad guys needed being put down. And truthfully, if it wasn't for wanting to make this, I would have put the game down because I was no longer having any fun by that point. While you do learn a decent amount about the Halo rings as well as some backstory through the retroactively added terminals, you learn very little about anything or anyone else, including the titular main character. The legendary Master Chief gets no context or backstory beyond being a big green ass-kicking machine. Not that one. There is so much that is crying out for narrative exploration, from the Covenant to the UNSC and everything in between, but the story is used as little more than setup for what is to come, and thankfully all of the depth and context that I crave does eventually get explored in subsequent games and spin-offs, but there is just very little for me to sink my teeth into in Halo Combat Evolved.
All you greenhorns who wanted to see Covenant up close, this is gonna be your lucky day.
Of course, the crux of Halo is and always has been its gameplay, and while it definitely has aged, it still holds up remarkably well. It may be a bit less smooth and slower than FPSs of today, but the gunplay is still wonderful, as is the array of weapons available for Master Chief to collect on his way, from the much beloved Needler to the rocket launcher and those ever sticky plasma grenades that spell the end for whomever end up on the wrong side of them. However, weapons do feel somewhat underpowered, never really feeling like they do enough damage, often needing to unload an entire round of ammo to bring down a single enemy. That is, of course, not an issue with the likes of the shotgun or rocket launcher, yet in the hands of the enemies, weapons seem to do much more damage, taking much less time to turn that green armor red. Despite being quite clumsy and clunky, driving most of the available vehicles can be a lot of fun, be it knocking off your enemies from afar with the heavy weaponry on board, or simply mowing them down at speed. That being said, the secondary weapons tend to be quite pointless because they are about as accurate as a blind stormtrooper, and seemingly do about the same amount of damage. Also, while we are talking about the vehicles, I know I said they can be a lot of fun, but controlling them is pretty meh. I never was really a fan of controlling vehicles with the camera, especially when trying to aim and fire at something while trying to drive in a specific direction. This only leads you into a head-on collision with a tree or another bit of environment. While for the most part the design of each iconic map is pretty good, especially as the game goes on and each section opens up more and more, and the latter stages even add a good bit of verticality to the mix, the amount of repeating environments often left me confused as to whether I was even going the right way. Not to mention how it grew tiresome when it just felt like I was going round and round in circles, fending off the same enemies over and over again. Now, I understand why this is done, but I just needed something to differentiate between one hall and its subsequent room full of enemies from the next. It can make you feel like you are making zero progress at all, and simply that the same enemies are respawning every time you re-enter the seemingly same room. The enemies have a pretty good amount of variation, from the small meek grunts to the large tank-like hunters, and each are given their own personality through the aforementioned animations and their sound effects, all of which have only been improved with the update. Enemy AI is a highlight of the game because without it, Halo would just be another shooter. For example, the pathetic grunts are disciplined and organized when an elite is in the fight with them, but once that elite has been dispatched, the grunts all lose their composure and flail around trying to escape the clutches of death. while the elites will weave in and out of cover and try to get up close and melee you to disarm your shield. And when in vehicles, this good AI keeps its game up, and they will try and down you in more than one way, be that simply running you down, taking shots at a distance, or in the case of the Banshees, swooping in overhead on a bombing run of sorts before retreating to a safe distance to realign and go again. The enemy AI makes the game just as much as the good combat does, and it is pretty excellent here. Halo is not what I would call a difficult game, at least when I was playing on normal, as I normally do. There are no tricky bosses to speak of, and well, there are no bosses at all to speak of. But towards the climax of the campaign, Halo artificially ups its difficulty by simply overwhelming the player with seemingly unending waves of Flood, who are supremely frustrating, as well as more Covenant forces as well. This final third or so was so very little fun, having to continually fight through the same frustrating and in some cases undying enemies time and time again, just because of the sheer amount of them coming from all directions. Paired this with the repetitive environments, I wanted to tear my hair out at points. I'd lost all of the fun and enjoyment I was having with Halo because of this cheap and enduringly frustrating difficulty spike. The challenge hub has been added to Halo in the Master Chief Collection, which rewards you for such things as killing X amount of enemies in a certain way, for example, but this does very little for my purposes, and I had very little intention of looking at any of the objectives were it not for doing this. While it will add some good replay value for those who really enjoy the game, I did not have enough fun to warrant playing through the same frankly bare-bones story time and time again for some arbitrary XP points. The only collectibles to speak of in Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary are the skulls, which have been added to this version of the game, having made their debut in Halo 2, and if you wish to equip them, they will make your game that little bit more difficult, making it so you cannot pick up enemy guns or giving enemies more health, for instance. They can be a little tricky to come across. I actually didn't find a single one in my first playthrough, and wasn't until I checked online to make sure I hadn't simply missed any of the collectibles, which I had in fact done. Some are simply hidden behind objects that the game actively draws you away from, be that with an NPC talking to you or enemies being dropped around you, and then there are others that require a grenade or rocket jump to reach. While they do nothing for my needs of the game, I quite like the different take on these collectibles. Rather than rewarding you with some shiny gear, they actively change the game. Now, terminals are the only other collectible which have also retroactively been added to the game, having first been introduced in Halo 3. These terminals give you a small cutscene that gives you a small bit of backstory, which, as this is the first time I'm playing the game for the story, didn't do too much to shed light on what was really going on for me. So this is probably a nice touch for people coming back to the game, but for people experiencing this for the first time, maybe not so much. And finally, we come to the performance. So most of the issues I faced with the game were pretty minor standard fare stuff, from getting stuck behind NPCs, weaponry getting stuck in environments, and some odd voices skipping like an old CD in some cases. However, if you follow me on social media, you may know about this already. The biggest issue I had was an odd one, and I'm not entirely sure if it's with the Master Chief Collection itself or Game Pass, but I got over halfway through the game when, out of nowhere, the next time I tried to boot and load into my save, the Master Chief Collection would open, but I was unable to open any of the individual games. So I literally just had a menu and some settings to play around with. I kept being told that I had none of the games installed, like they were just randomly deleted from my PC, because I certainly didn't do it. And I honestly still have no idea what happened. I tried restarting my PC, uninstalling and reinstalling from the Microsoft Store instead of directly through Game Pass. I fiddled with the game files and none of it worked. Not one time did any of it work. So I had to put the game down. I came back to the game about 2 weeks or so after trying everything, and tried one last time to reinstall. Otherwise, I'd have to plug in my Xbox One X and capture from that. But then the game just mysteriously worked fine, like nothing had happened. It is a known issue, but nothing that seems to have worked for other people worked for me. I don't know if there was some kind of update that screwed the game up, but I was thankfully able to get back in, and granted it was a few weeks later, but I was really thankful because after playing Halo on mouse and keyboard, I really didn't want to go back to just using a controller. Mouse and keyboard Halo just feels so right. In the end, Halo left me feeling quite conflicted. I know this game could be a lot of fun because I've had a lot of fun with the game in the past, but this time it just didn't feel the same. It was missing something. Before it felt much grander. Was it me? Have my taste really changed that much? But then at some point it hit me. As I mentioned earlier, this was the first time that I was playing the game solo and actually focusing on the story. Every other time I had spent any significant amount of time with Halo, it was with a friend or my brother, and having that other person to bounce off of supplemented the lack of story and the frustrating difficulty spikes with silly comments and joking around with that other person. But without that co-op element, the game feels so much more bare, and I know that the story does get built upon, and honestly the lack of story, while disappointing, isn't detrimental given how good the gameplay can be, but combined with the repetitive environments and level design with the artificial difficulty spikes, it left the back third of my time with the game really tainted, especially as there wasn't another person distracting me from those elements this time. Given how much the later games improve on the Halo formula, maybe excluding the newer 343 outings, other than for co-op or in retrospect to see how far the series has come, I'm not honestly sure I'd recommend Halo Combat Evolved being the one you check out, especially with the fact that most of the other games in the series are available very easily through the Master Chief Collection, or even easier through Game Pass. I think it's fair to say for potentially all of the Halo games, they are phenomenal when played with another person in co-op or just playing the multiplayer. But as a single player singular experience, and without being steeped in nostalgia, Halo Combat Evolved just doesn't quite hold up as well as some of the other games in its genre